This week, a Future Forward special edition, the future of work.
Are you too old? Are you too young? Ageism cuts both ways.
Then, gender diversity in tech. Who's getting it right?
And if you're looking for where to land, a few boomtowns you might not have thought of.
I'm Steve Rosenbaum, and excited to announce our special guest host this week, Alexa Scordato. Welcome to the pod, Alexa.
Thanks so much, Steve.
So before we get into the chapters, and we have three chapters in the show today, we're going to do ageism and how it goes both ways. Then we're going to do gender diversity, and then we're going to talk about boomtowns. But before we get into the chapters, I was trying to figure out how to describe to our fabulous audience your background, and like you're kind of a professional disruptor-ish person.
I don't know if you would call me a disruptor. I think I was just born at the right place at the right time, which is really just the intersection of technology being pervasive and aligning with the things that I'm interested in, which is really storytelling.
And you know, I was looking at your resume and realizing I've known you through all of your jobs. Like I emailed you the other day and it bounced back because I was emailing your Mzinga account.
Oh my goodness. You've known me since I was like a baby.
Yeah.
Baby, meaning like 20 years old.
So we're gonna get into the chapters. I also want to just say a big shout out to our friends at IEEE Spectrum. IEEE Spectrum is the flagship magazine and website of IEEE, the world's largest professional organization devoted to engineering and the applied sciences. And they've got a bead on the tech boomtowns situation, which we're going to talk about later on the pod. But let's start with ageism. So what I realized as we were talking about ageism the other day is it really could go both ways. And you've been both, I'm guessing, a victim of it, and also kind of you argue that that some of your mentees are faced with it as well. But let's start with, how do you define ageism?
I mean, ageism is when your age is actively used to put you at a disadvantage. I think that's the cleanest definition of it. How it's playing out is, I'd say, people just making assumptions about who you are and how you're going to show up at work because of a number. So,
not to put you on the spot, but I'll ask a hard question just to kind of get off on the right foot. I mean, so, you know, when you were, you know, deep in the throes of hiring, you know, you at one point had 26 direct reports. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Not direct reports, but like a team of 26. Yes.
Right. So like, were any of those 26 people over the age of 40?
One or two, maybe.
Wow, that's impressive. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I see the world as a complex thing. You know, when people are hiring, particularly in this digital, fast-changing world, you can see why someone who walks in who's not a digital native, and we'll talk about what that means, might say, listen, you're really nice and all, but, you know, like, you're my dad's age, and I got to hire people that are part of a cohort. Is that ageism?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's this subconscious bias where you see someone who indexes of an older age group, and you immediately think they are not of the internet. They did not grow up with it. They are not tech savvy. They do not move fast and break things. Actually, maybe they probably break a lot of things, but they don't really know how to fix them. My parents do that.
So I think I used to believe that was bias, and I used to be against it. But I've become a little bit more conscious of the fact that there are some things that your generation understands differently than mine about how. So here's a different, like, we'll calibrate our differences a little bit. Like, among your cohort, among your friends, how many of them make media regularly?
90%, if you include Snapchat, Instagram, posts on Twitter or Facebook.
90%. So, you know, and without indicting my cohort, I guarantee you that my cohort, that number is more like 30.
I believe that. I mean, even with my family, it's probably 30-40%.
So I guess what I'm challenging is this concept of ageism. Maybe it's just hiring the right skills for the right job in a digital world. Maybe it's not a number. Maybe it's a skill set.
I think what we have to understand is that it goes back to this idea that the technology is just a tool set. But with the technology comes an entire set of behaviors, norms, and values that maybe are generational. And so one of those things might actually be transparency. I believe that previous generations valued transparency more than younger generations. Obviously, that is a broad generalization, but this idea of broadcasting your avocado toast and what you ate for breakfast is inherently weird for people who did not grow up with the technology. Creating a photo that disappears 15 seconds after you took it also seems very weird.
Yes. So there's a Fast Company article that says ageism is thriving, but I think that article presumes that ageism means older people are getting kind of drummed out of the digital core. What's your experience? I guess let's start by, if ageism is a problem from the way you look at the internets, what's the problem?
So there's a huge topic around diversity and inclusion, which we'll get to, but ageism is something that I think is not really talked about enough. So if you really believe that diverse teams solve problems more effectively because of different perspectives that are introduced in that process, we're potentially cutting out some really valuable inputs because of age. And so I'd say the problem at large is macro. It's a larger diversity and inclusion conversation.
Yeah,
but when it comes to ageism specifically, I think that change happens slowly over time. If anything, sometimes it's generational. It takes decades for the history of change to occur. And so if you can't teach an old dog new tricks, or businesses and markets actually take slower to evolve or be disrupted, then in some ways this notion of moving quickly, you need older people to kind of slow younger people down. It's almost like a checks and balances system. Like, hey, we can't go too fast in one direction or the other.
So without outing a non-employer of yours, can you remember a story where you went in for a job which you were sure you were right for? You did the interview, and you just had this feeling in your gut that you didn't get over the finish line because someone looked at you chronologically as opposed to intellectually?
I can't think of a specific time when I didn't get the job. I've actually been very, very lucky because I've inserted myself into opportunities where people were willing to give me a shot. But I can definitely say that once I had the job, it was like, you have the job, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Meaning, first time I was hired, hey, Alexa, you're smart, you're young, and you're a woman. Guess what? You're going to have to work 10 times harder to be respected and perceived differently. That was a really hard lesson.
I think what happens at the moment we're at is that particularly big companies say we need to hire more young people because A, they know this digital stuff that we kind of don't get, and B, they're cheaper and they'll work harder and we can torture them and make them work insane hours. But then when you start to say, well, this thing you're doing is an old-fashioned way to solve that problem, there's actually a newfangled way. The mature, seasoned executive says, yeah, well, this is how we do it here, right? Like you kids might share avocado toast on Snapchat, but our client doesn't want that. Just go write a tweet or something.
Yeah, I think this again speaks to the larger problem, which is it's not as black and white as we know how to do something better than you do. I think it gets almost to this process of, can two disparate groups, two people who have different sets of opinions on how to show up at work, have a real conversation. And I think age gets in the way of that, and this dependency on technology and knowing the tech or not knowing the tech is actually creating a conversation gap in the workplace.
So you're the first person to ever use the phrase reverse mentoring that I'd ever met. And this has been something you've been talking about now for as long as I've known you. First of all, for our listeners that don't know the phrase, explain how it works.
So when I was 20 years old, I graduated from Barnard and I entered the workforce, and I found that there were just a lot of things that I knew that sort of these tenured professionals didn't. And so I was actually coaching them on things like how to create a LinkedIn profile, how to blog, or even just how to get off Internet Explorer and use a better web browser. And at the same time, I was also learning about them in the process, which was how to raise a round of funding, what evaluation was, how to actually scale a company and a hiring process. So I called it reverse mentoring because it was really about taking digital natives who understood these new technologies and actually coaching veteran executives or seasoned professionals. But at the same time, it was really a knowledge exchange. It wasn't just, young people teaching old people. I'd say it was mutually beneficial.
From this, thinking of it like a knowledge transplant, how often does the transplant work and how often does it fail?
Probably 50-50. I'd say that there's a transactional knowledge exchange. It might literally be a how-to, or here's how to download Uber on your app. I literally did that this morning while I was at the airport. This older couple said, "Do you know how to use Uber?" And I actually had to show them how to call a car. I'd say, that's the lightweight stuff. The really deep work, the stuff that doesn't often that isn't really successful a lot of the time, is actually in the organizational design and the process of working collaboratively. So a really practical example of that might actually be around remote work. There is still this mentality that we kind of clock in to a job like factory workers, like with punch cards. If you're not in your seat by 9 a.m., you're not working. I've had the fortune of being part of teams that have been scaled in a distributed way. And so this idea of video chat, Zoom rooms, bopping in and out of Slack and email and chat, there's a fluidity to that and a comfort level that I just think is really hard to master.
So one of the things that you talked about in the TEDx talk that you gave in 2009 was about these kind of annoying millennial truisms that you pushed back on. That was 10 years ago, so it was a long time ago. Remind the listeners of what the millennial kind of, not arguments, but like the criticisms that kind of an older generation, millennials, they're stubborn, they're whatever. And then tell me if you think that's changed at all since that TED Talk. And I'll put the link to the TED Talk in the show notes.
Yeah, I think, one of the core pillars is that the millennials we're the me generation. And I'd say that that's played out times 10. Kim Kardashian published a book about selfies. That is probably the best cultural artifact to reflect millennials in a nutshell. That said, it's both good and bad. I'd say millennials as a whole maybe feel entitled, stubborn. They sort of want, they expect things to come to them without necessarily putting in the time. These were the stereotypes that I said 10 years ago. I'd say that still plays out. I hire kids out of college and they immediately want, senior manager, director titles. And they haven't even spent 1 or 2 years in a full-time position anywhere. But that said, over the last decade, we've also seen millennials now take on management roles. And I think one of the best things that has happened as a result is that you actually have managers who are deeply invested in other people. And I actually think way more self-aware than a previous cohort of managers. The me generation is inherently more self-aware, and maybe I would go so far as to say radically introspective.
All right, so let's move to chapter 2 because it's related, but it's different. And this, obviously is in some ways more urgently topical, just given the headlines of the last 12 months. Gender diversity in tech. There's some statistics that we pulled that I guess I'd never seen distributed as clearly as the chart that we found. Pretty disturbing. Like, hard to say the problem's over or anything like over. Well, here, let's go back to your 26 coworkers. How did that group pan out in terms of gender diversity?
So we were marketers, and so I think we skewed actually more women. We were 80-90% women. So it was the opposite, but we were partnering with product and engineering teams that were almost 100% men.
So that's interesting. Why do you think that is? Why is marketing women and engineering men? Does that go back to, science and technology education in elementary school to some extent?
Totally. It's like the hard skills, and then marketing is a soft skill. And so it doesn't even surprise me that marketing and engineering teams are often talking past each other or don't know how to communicate and collaborate well, because I think it's really internally it plays out as like the engineers know the science, know the logic, know the math, and the marketers, it's just the fluff. It's the feelings, it's the brand, it's the perception.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and it makes me really angry because I think the problem with those kinds of assumptions is that they feed on themselves, right?
Absolutely.
All right, so there's a website called Information is Beautiful. We pulled up a diversity in tech, very very visual chart. As you look down this list, I mean the immediate company that jumps out as being almost 50-50 is Indiegogo. So that's interesting. But there are some surprising number of companies that are, dramatically lower than you might imagine. So, for example, YouTube at 31%. Given the fact that they've got a woman CEO and have for now 5 or 6 years, you would think that would be a number that they could have brought up. And having been on the Google campus, there's no shortage of women engineers at the Googleplex. So I don't know why YouTube doesn't participate in that. Anything in there that you found surprising?
I think it's hard to look at these numbers as a whole without looking at the specific teams. Again, you can have, 100% women on a marketing team, 100% men on an engineering team. I really actually think I'm not sure how useful looking at the overall company population is without examining the teams.
So I think that's probably a fair criticism, both of this chart and of my pulling it as the example of this conversation. But I guess I'm trying to get to the nugget of the question, which is, the happy answer to this chapter would simply be to say, Alexa, you're great. You're out there advocating for women. Women are the future. I love that shirt. But things are all moving in a good direction. All we have to do is just go through a couple more cycles and we'll be fine. But I don't think you're as sanguine about it as that.
No, and your chart isn't bad because what it's painting a picture of is the fact that these are companies building technologies that are supposed to be used by all of humanity. And if the people who are building products and services don't reflect the constituents who they serve, then there's a real problem in that.
So
women make up 50% of the population, yet these companies, which in some ways are small economies or small countries, are not 50-50.
So now let's put the question to a test, which is, if the company has a set of policies and practices and behaviors, is it the responsibility of women that want to grow their footprint in that company to act more like their male counterparts? Do they have to go to the rowdy drink fest on Friday afternoon because that's how the company, Uber's a terrific example of a terrible culture that mistreated women. And it seemed like the way that, you and I have talked about this before we went, started recording. Like, how do you say to your peers, you should grow in the company you're in, and you should hire more women, and you should create a space for them, but it doesn't mean act more like your male counterparts. Be your own unique self.
So for women who are just starting out, I sort of have this like 3-part spiel. One is it's easier to change the people than to change the people. You have to recognize that people are going to believe what they believe sometimes, no matter what. And so if you are going to be effective on the job, there is an element of conformity. Cultures at companies are a real thing. And so you have to be aware of that. But you always have a choice whether you want to be there or not. And so I encourage people to find companies and in that job process, really vet companies based off of the values, principles, and integrity of how they operate. That said, that's a luxury. Not every company can be a Patagonia that really lives by its values. And so I'd say that women today, my peers, I think we have a real choice, which is to choose how we want to show up. Yes, we can play the game, we can try to be part of the boys' club, but in some ways, that's actually just reinforcing, I think, I don't want to say bad behavior, but almost like legacy frameworks. There are 2 things that women need on the job. We need mentors and we need champions. Mentors are going to be the people who've been there, who've done that. Your advocates or champions are going to be people who actually take their privilege and advocate for you. And, Steve, you were like one of those people. I was 20 years old. I had 0 experience, and you just saw the potential. And you were like, you know what, Alexa, I'm going to give you a shot.
Someday I'll tell good Alexa stories on the pod about wildly successful things that you did at 20 years old, but we won't do that today. But you know what I'm realizing as I hear you, and I hadn't put it together until just now. I saw a documentary about Barnard 6 or 7 months ago, and I didn't understand how deeply ingrained in that institution raising up women's voices was in the place, and not just women who walked in the door confident and strong-willed and who could express themselves, but women who sat in the back of the room and said, no, I'll let the man speak first. And it really was a place, I hear in your voice a sense of confidence and mission that came from that institution. Am I wrong?
Oh, you're absolutely right. I think if you ask Columbia professors, can you distinguish Barnard students from Columbia students? They'd say not really, but in a qualitative sense, Barnard women actually speak up more.
Yeah, but that's not because of the recruiting of women that have a voice it's because it's part of the process of making sure that people leave the institution with that as a you might show up being timid and quiet, but you don't leave that way.
Yeah, I think some of it is the psychological safety of being in a very women-oriented environment.
Interesting.
You are in a 10-person colloquium, and you're actually in fierce debate. And that's something that's priming you for the future debates you're going to have at work. And whether it's men and women in the room, I think you just graduate with this sense of confidence that you have knowledge and a point of view that's worth sharing.
So we're going to get to the Boomtown Chapter 3 in just a moment, but I want to just, how strongly, for companies that say, Alexa, this is really great and you seem awesome and all, but we're fine. We're gonna grow slowly, and how urgent is it that companies take gender diversity in their workforce seriously? What is there a ticking clock at which point they start to really be behind the 8 ball?
I think we're at this inflection point in tech where there's a moral imperative to actually put diversity up front and center in your operating principles. we have an obligation as technologists and business leaders to build responsibly and to consider the needs and the societal implications of what we're doing.
Yeah. By the way, that well said, and thank you. I'll put a slightly sharper point on it than that. I think that if in 5 years you've missed this chapter, you're effectively building buggy whips, because you know it's not a nice to do; it's a must do. All right, so let's get to this Boomtown article that IEEE published. So Tekla Perry came out. She pulled some research from Indeed. I found the numbers, and particularly some of the smaller boomtowns, really surprising, I have to say. Did anything jump out at you? And then I'll tell you what I was shocked by.
So I wasn't really surprised in the sense that working at Stack Overflow, I studied developer populations and also where developer jobs were emerging. And so this is actually something that I've been looking at for years. It's interesting because you actually have the rise of places like Silicon Slopes and Silicon Prairie. People don't realize companies like Garmin are in Kansas City, and Salt Lake City, Utah has, companies like Pluralsight, which went public in the last couple of years.
Is part of what's changed, and maybe this is something that from your previous experience, is something that's changed, that more and more people work remotely, so you don't need to a company that has some number of core engineers in, for example, Boulder, can also have engineers elsewhere, so that you don't need to have every seat filled locally.
Absolutely. The best piece of advice I can give any company that's hiring developers is to consider remote or distributed work an option. It is so competitive and expensive to hire developers in markets like New York and Silicon Valley. And remote work is just a great way to access a talent pool that you didn't really have access to before. We found at Stack Overflow that companies who listed remote jobs actually got 8 to 9 times more volume in terms of inbound applicants.
All right, so the paranoia, and I'm not a CTO, but the paranoia of an employer back when I was employing people at large numbers was remote people will log on, get some stuff done, go have a sandwich, walk the dog, water the garden, and I know that there's now measurement tools, and you can see how much, there's all kinds of ways to kind of, officiate engagement remotely, but I don't think it's about having engineers doing work they're interested in and they want to write the code, right? I mean,
Absolutely. I mean, it's not even specific to engineers as knowledge workers. I mean, you're a maker yourself, you're a writer. You can't guarantee that the moments of brilliance are going to strike between the hours of 9 to 5.
Nope.
If you have to write or produce something, whether it's an essay or lines of code, who cares if you need to take a walk and go out to lunch and then come back? Who cares if you are most creative from 11 to 2 a.m. when the kids are sleeping? I don't care where people do the work. I just care that it gets done.
Yeah. So number one on the chart that from the Spectrum article is Huntsville, Alabama. Wouldn't have guessed that in a million years. And I immediately want to reverse engineer. I mean, is it near a university? Is it cost of living? Is it lifestyle? What's the thing that makes Huntsville, dramatically higher on the list than, say, Raleigh, Durham, or Durham, Chapel Hill? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think my eyes immediately jumped to Baltimore, which didn't surprise me because the DC Metro Tech area has the highest density of developers working for government agencies and places like Lockheed. But Huntsville, Alabama, I actually have no idea.
Yeah.
What's going on in Huntsville?
And Ann Arbor, which makes sense because it's right near University of Michigan, is dramatically. It's still a metro hotspot, but it's not. By the way, I also Colorado Springs, Colorado, interesting as well. So just as we're running out of time here, what's the advice that you would, we've talked about three things. We've talked about diversity in the workplace. We've talked about ageism, both too old, too young. And now we're talking about hotspots. Can you boil this into a thesis for how work is changing? Can we get a little bit of Alexa brilliance?
I'd say that whether you are someone who is a decision maker or someone who's an individual contributor, really understanding the values and principles that you hold near and dear to your heart and bringing those to the job is more important than ever. And finding companies and organizations that are aligned to that is pretty critical. If you want to build a company for the future and you want to be a leader or an employee at that company, then I think marrying values with value creation is really what's happening today. That is the ask. There is no longer a world where we can say, don't take it personally, this is just business. Absolutely not. Who we are as people are the people we bring to the job. And so whether you are 50 years old, 15 years old, a digital native, a developer, a woman, we have to actually acknowledge that people come in with all of this stuff. And to the extent that we can actually acknowledge it, operationalize it, and then leverage it for business benefits, those are going to be the companies that win.
I'm left speechless. I said deliver Alexa brilliance, and you delivered it right on time. Thank you so much. This was really great. It was nice talking with you, and
so much fun, Steve.
Look forward to having you back real soon.